We'll crack on with our panel discussion and questions. Hopefully everyone found all of the talks so far very interesting, and we've had a lot of questions coming. So I will try to pass those on to our speakers. So just to remind everyone, we have our lovely project manager, John, over there. And then we have Garry and Heather and Michal. Perhaps I should start very quickly. If we have had anyone in the room who would like to ask a question, we have a roving mic. So my colleague Isaac over there is going to just bring a microphone to you and you can ask a question that way. Please don't start asking questions before that, before you have the microphone. Otherwise, no one online would hear your question. Perhaps I'll just I'll start with a question for Michal, just to kick things off. So someone asked, how do we turn international pledges into culture change? I mean, you talked about a lot of motion in terms of people being excited about nature-based solutions and about this kind of push towards it. But how do we actually change the culture, the mindset of coastal practitioners or engineers? How do we make that kind of thinking change?
Well, thanks for the question. Not an easy one, yeah? At least my experience tells that normally the population would be divided in 20-60-20. 20 people for whom it's natural, doing in this case nature-based solutions. 20 will never do it, and we are fighting for the remaining 60. And there it usually depends on economy. So my reply would be, what we need to do is to attach a real value to ecosystem services. In other words, if people are comparing then on a coast, let's say floodplain, wetland, and a holiday resort, they would not be comparing plenty of mosquitoes on one hand and plenty of billions of dollars or euros or pounds on the other hand, but something that is giving a lot of economic value besides others. It's defending the coast from economic loss and damage.
Mm-hmm. Did any of the other panelists want to add anything? Garry, you don't need to do anything with it. Just.
Yes, well, I think that's a story. Something I didn't really emphasize too much is, I suppose, apart from trying to show what the examples were, is really telling that story, I suppose, that human story in the past to give it a value. And I didn't really go into it, but part of the process is actually to score and rate and value some of those heritage assets, to give them a rating so that we can then calibrate them or compare them like by like. And that's going to, as far as I suppose we're concerned as sort of historians, is a way to try and apply a value that you can calibrate and then you can use and then you can compare and contrast as these systems in recognition of this asset does develop through time. So we're working through it to try and give something a rating, if that's because that's something that coastal engineers tend to understand and financiers. Give it a value and a rating, whether they know it or not. As long as it looks like it's +5, it'll be good. So we're working on that.
Yeah, I think this kind of comes back to the giving value to NBS that we've heard about today. And it's also about measuring success of NBS pilots, which Pip talked about. I have another question, which maybe we can go to John, because he mentioned it at the beginning, with the clash with tourism. So someone's wondering if nature-based solutions are not implementable everywhere. Have you considered, like, why not focus on areas where it can make a lot of difference rather than trying to do it in places where it causes a lot of conflict with social and economic drivers such as tourism or recreation?
I suppose the question is, why are we looking just to do it in areas where nature-based solutions work? Because generally you have a nature-based solution there anyway. The big issue is trying to get it to work in places where people think it won't work. So like we gave the example of Middle Kirky, you can do a nature-based solution and make it work with tourism, economy, all the other bits, and actually it's cheaper than doing a hard infrastructure as well. So it's about, like you just said, with the shift of mindset that needs to be done at a more community and decision maker level that really needs to be input. The nature will work.
Yeah, Heather, do you want to?
Yeah, I would. We had a conversation in the room about greening the grey, and I think it's an integrated design approach, but also there's a lot of other underpinning for such a long time in terms of investment, in terms of design, in terms of risk, in terms of insurance. Capital works and grey infrastructure is something that makes sense. It's why we call it bricks and mortar, talking from the investment perspective. So you have to, there's a learning curve to have with nature-based solutions. And quite often we can have what you want. You can have it quite a lot cheaper if you design it early stage and you actually work through some of those other things which we've had in terms of building and engineering these solutions, over-engineering these solutions, which have been around for a very long time. So there is an education to have and a rethinking to have of a number of different pieces to make that happen.
Okay. Yeah.
Just very quickly, two points to it. Yeah, comparing nature-based solutions and let's say grey infrastructure. Looking at the interest, politicians. It's much easier, way easier to show a beautiful wall made of concrete, very high, very impressive to the voters if this is what they want to see. Yeah. So again, we are coming back to the opinion of the public, to the mind shift. If people do appreciate more a nature-based solution, then the politician in question for sure will go for a nature-based solution and not for the wall. And the second example is economic. And this used to be a huge problem also in all sorts of funding that I've been talking about. It's very easy for everybody to imagine, okay, I'm going to construct a huge wall. I can very well attach economic value to it. I can make a nice tender. Companies can make a lot of profit on it. Very easy, very easy. So what we need to do is to put the economic value again on the other side. And here, insurance companies, for instance, I think should play a key, vital role. Because once they say, look, under current circumstances, your property is not insurable, people will start thinking about it.
Well, I will say don't forget the longue durée, because that gives you an indication of various patterns of change. There's no point trying to build a nature-based solution in a way that it's not sustainable, of course. So you have to understand the past, and that comes back to issues that I mentioned before, like land slips and insurance that Michal was talking about. But yes, just understand those processes first.
Yeah, so by the way, if anyone in the room wants to have any questions or add anything to anything that's being said, just wave your hand at me and we'll get you a microphone. So there's always that option. From what you've been saying so far, it sounds like it always comes back to money. There's always the economic drivers, which are more important, both from an investment perspective and from perhaps what people see as valuable, rather than, I think Michal said something to me earlier today, where if we're comparing a big project with loads of money being spent and building new hotels and stuff, everyone understands there's a lot of value in that. There's a lot of pounds in it, if you like, or euros or dollars. But if you put in a nice nature-based solution, salt marsh, all you get is mosquitoes, and people don't really like that. So it's really about adding value to those solutions. And a couple of the people online have asked, how can we attach this value to these solutions, because they're so unique. In each different city, there is a different custom solution being implemented. It's not like a seawall, which is the same everywhere. It has the same engineering principles and requirements, and it's very easy to quantify. So how do we actually come up with a system that works everywhere? Would you like to take that one, Heather? Yeah.
Well, I think that there's two things to one is that value means a lot of things to living people. When you talk about investment, value means one thing, but it isn't actually just about the money. It's about who makes the decision and who takes the risk. Mm-hmm. And so we were having conversations about many of us answer to a board of directors, to governors, and there's not just a money issue, there's a governance issue as well. So I think that understanding that somebody holds the risk for that is very important, and to be able to unpack and be able to shift the perceptions around risk is really important, both from a cultural and behavioral perspective, but also from an investment perspective. And there are people who work on that, but it's bringing those two together. And again, there's quite a divide between the project delivery. We all have a sense of value. We have natural capital that we talk about. We have social capital that we talk about, where we try to codify value. And there's a missing link between that and also investment value as well. So I've sort of forgotten your question. What was your question again?
I mean, to be honest, you're touching on a lot of important things. That the notion of value is not necessarily just monetary. But I was trying to get at how do we make a system that works everywhere, where nature-based solutions, by their essence, are so different in each location.
Well, I think they're different, but I think there are going to be common themes that they solve the same problem. So there will be intrinsic common denominators between each of these projects that fail to scale, as you said. So it's actually being able to quantify those common themes that solve the ultimate problem. And when I did my presentation, I talked about the green bond, and there will be special purpose vehicles, and those who are trying to find what those stackable benefits are, how can they scale that. And so I think there has to be a meeting of minds to understand the value, but also how we can create those common stackable benefits in a way that the impact investment services ecosystem can respond to it.
Mm-hmm. Do you want to? Yeah.
Yeah, very briefly. Of course, there is the, let's say, pessimistic or negative way of doing it. Yeah, and the insurance companies again are the best in doing it. They evaluate the risk, the likelihood of an event, the magnitude of an event, so the loss and damage that would occur by, let's say, floods. And here you've got the value. However, there are also positive ways, like we do with carbon. Yeah, whatever you do, for instance, you plant. There was another question. You plant a really climate resilient forest, and you get some value because carbon already has some value. So what we need to do is to create a similar value on the biodiversity side. And I very much hope it would happen. I do think people are already talking about it in Montreal. Tomorrow, you may know that COP15 on biodiversity starting in Montreal, and I've heard at least some people suggesting that there could be discussion along these lines. And ultimately, I think it's the only option that people would know that biodiversity has a value completely abstracting from carbon, but different kind of value that we are all in this room aware of, but the market is not.
Mm-hmm. I think Heather wants to, yeah.
Sorry, I'll try to be quick about this, and it's something that I meant to put a pin in to mention, is that the new Environment Act that was passed, I think it was last year, but it's in play now, is biodiversity net gain. And so that is kind of a way of thinking about carbon sequestration in the way that Michal's talking about this, is that biodiversity net gain is when there's any new development, again, this is in England, doesn't apply to Wales and Scotland, and this is very much pretty much a terrestrial proposition. But when there's new development, the development has to provide 10% of habitat creation. So it's not mitigation, it's not restoration, but creation. And that is something that is a part of the new biodiversity markets. When I mentioned the NEIRF scheme, most of those 77 projects are testing, you might say codifying, investing in a stackable benefits using biodiversity net gain. Thank you.
Did you have any comments, Garry?
Yes, I think going back to the physical aspect, I suppose, of what do you do? You've got all these different, such a variety of different coastlines to employ nature-based solutions. I think within the SARCC project, it identified the 7 pilots, and they are varied, they are different, and each one has a response to it. And I think that's something that we're going to build on, and hopefully build on within the visualization tool, and act as a sort of a bit of a decision tree. You've got a certain sort of coastline, what nature-based solution is appropriate. But I think actually, following the discussion we've just had about incorporating value, I think that is maybe an element that we should consider in addition to identify the, well, say whatever that value might be, carbon sequestration or whatever it is. I think that should be incorporated maybe in the next phase to actually open up, rather than just the physiological side, the physical side, coastal geomorphology, but the actual value side in a tool such as the visualization tool.
Mm-hmm. Does anyone have any comments in the room? There, Isaac, would you mind?
Matthew Moore from Anglian Water. Obviously, coming from a water company, I've one of the big bad investors, or capital investors. But we had a real shift at the beginning of this year, moving from a traditional framework justifying value to a true value framework, looking at right across the 6 capitals. So you would have you would start. We used to look at flooding and put a small cost to flooding that maybe was our cost. But now we've changed that to look at the full economic value to the consumer and to us. So suddenly the price of an external flooding went from £6,000 right up to £60,000 to accurately reflect the true benefit of the true consequence. But you look at value framework for positives and the negatives, suddenly the creation of a green space has a positive value that you can attribute to it. Like some of the projects in Belgium, the creation of a space where you can actually walk through is more than just flooding. It's got that societal value to go along with it. And I think you talk about how you can have a basic system where you can deploy, where you look at things equally. And yes, whilst the value framework puts everything back into monetary figures, it does look right across the 6 capitals, doesn't just focus on flooding, BNG, carbon, you already mentioned, and looks at the whole benefit of a project.
Thank you. Any comments, or anyone else want to mention anything? Okay, yeah. So I think this is again, a topic that's come up in the questions a few times is the value that's attached to the different nature-based solutions might be broad, and this has been mentioned a few times. But in some cases, the status quo just isn't going to work in terms of long-term sustainable management of the coast in some places. And going towards a nature-based solution that is more sustainable will inevitably need a change in behavior from people living on the coast. It will need a change in the type of business that might be taking place. And certain, maybe even long-standing features of the coastline might inevitably have to be lost. So how do we interact with people affected by these changes in a positive way? How do we let them understand that it is worth changing towards a nature-based solution in the long term, where from their perspective all it means is they are losing their livelihood perhaps, or the town that they've lived in for the last 40, 50 years is just going to drastically change? Do you want to take it, John?
I mean, if you take a prime example, if you look at the Norfolk coast where the Environment Agency bought up a load of houses, unfortunately sometimes decisions have to be made at that sort of level where you have to give up to nature. You can defend and defend and defend, but ultimately it's not cost effective. So that is a nature-based solution itself, and just giving up. And a lot of people don't realise that. I mean, it's a lot about education and looking at a whole system approach, because obviously anything you do in a system like a coastline has a knock-on effect to somewhere else. So it's not always an engineering solution of sorting out a problem here using an engineer and not thinking about where it affects it down here, and especially not thinking about how it affected it 4,000 years ago. So it's a whole system approach looking at things. You can't just look at a problem and go, we're going to fix it with this.
Yeah. So you're saying that there is that intervention required really from like a governing body or a public body at some point to kind of brute force through the locals.
I think we're just going to have to be more clever about how we look at sorting problems out and not just coming up with a quick fix engineering solution. We're actually going to have to look at the whole system approach and start thinking properly. Looking at the biodiversity net gain definitely helps, because then when you start looking at that, you start looking at what affects other areas by doing what you're doing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Andrew?
I think also that
It is on. Yeah.
What John just struck me, we were saying, is that communities have to own the problem as well. So sometimes the problem's inevitable and it's going to happen. I was thinking what Michal said about Tuvalu. I mean, that's such a horrible proposition that I'm not going to be able to grow old in my own community, and that's a terrible thing. And on different scale, communities may or may not realize that they might be faced with that. But I think at the heart of it, the community, individuals need to own the problem. So it might be a combination of, here's the intervention we can deploy, but it also has to be, what can I do? Because there's nothing worse in a sense of helplessness or learned helplessness in not actually being able to grapple with the problem. So actually just showing a picture of what's happened in the past and what's going to happen in the future and how you're going to have to adapt is actually something that we all should be doing, but allowing the communities, whoever they might be, to saying, well, I'm going to have to change what my work is then. I'm going to have to change how I make money. I can see I might have to live somewhere else.
Yeah, those are all big challenges. Did you want to add?
Yeah, I can continue in the row. It just basically, just giving an example to what Heather and John already mentioned, the ownership. Yeah, the ownership for me, it's the key to the problem. And maybe to give an example of a project in the Czech Republic that is also one of those here described in the brochure. It's called Living Landscape, and there the participation of the public is put on a higher level, meaning not participation in a way, let's talk about it, but participation in a way, let's do it. You, the public, you are actors, you are protagonists of the change. And in this very project, the idea is that people who live in a certain community, in a certain river basin, they go out to the landscape and they map the potential for water retention in that particular river basin. It's sophisticated and very simple at the same time. Yeah? Basically taking all the maps that are at your disposal, taking your mobile phone with a Q field, having a QGIS in your computer, transferring the data, and suddenly you come up with very easily, with very limited knowledge, you come up with several hundreds of proposals what can be done in the landscape to help retain water. And then, of course, we do need an engineer who would finally say, this water hole needs to be this size, etc., etc. But already somebody is, the public is there in the landscape, involved, having ownership, caring about it, contributing to the solution, hence hopefully not having the despair or not losing the hope, and then more likely to accept a solution that would be imposed eventually by authorities, because they would be already part of the problem and would be aware of what is at stake.
Mm-hmm. Garry?
Well, I better mention the wisdom of hindsight. I think there's The issue that we are where we are now, and it's a bit of a societal problem. So if we've got people with the best intentions built houses near the sea that we know 4,000 years ago were falling into the cliffs were falling down as a consequence of change, that wasn't really recognised, and so in a certain extent that's a bit of a challenge. Now you can try and give them a better understanding as to what's happened in the past, and the fact that what's happening now is fairly inevitable, and managed retreat's going to have to happen, or just retreat. But that's not really going to save the day for them. But it does mean that we've really got to start putting the message out now more so, and letting people know that if they're starting to build and develop on the coastline, these are the issues that are happening. I know it's to a certain extent incorporated in part of the planning regimes, but really a lot of people still don't understand how mobile the coast is and how it's changed in the past. So if that message was put out there, then you can get that wisdom from hindsight. You can get society to understand that there are challenges here, and society will then accept it. It's just a bit difficult to do straight away, but you've got to start and push forward.
Do we have any comments in the room? Jean-Marie over there.
Thank you, Jean-Marie Buys from HZ University of Applied Sciences in Zealand. We also did some research about communication about these kind of developments, and what we see is that there's also a difference between that decision makers and practitioners especially focus on ecosystem regulating and producing ecosystem services, so like flood risk management, biodiversity, but that the public is especially triggered by more the cultural ecosystem services, like the attractiveness of the landscape. Is it also something which you recognize? And can this mean also something for the communication about nature-based solutions?
You would like to take that? Garry?
Well, in relation to people being concerned about the cultural aspects, as opposed to, not sure how to answer that really. So, could you just summarise that again? Sorry, Jean-Marie.
We see that in the communication by practitioners and decision makers, they especially focus on regulating and producing ecosystem services like flood risk management, biodiversity, topics which also a lot are discussed today, but that the public is especially triggered by more the cultural ecosystem services like attractiveness of the landscape, potential use for recreation, and those kind of ecosystem services trigger more the public than the messages that often are communicated by practitioners and decision makers.
Yeah.
Okay, so I can give quite a good example from Southend on this case. So one of our pilots is looking at using vegetated shingle, which effectively is a planted area on the beach. Now, one of the reasons why we looked at this area is because a number of the members of the public actually said, what's wrong with this area? Why is it so messy? Can't we get rid of these weeds on the beach? So the big issue around that was basically doing botanical studies, invertebrate studies, and actually understanding what the biodiversity net gain is, and then communicating that to the public, because we know, but they don't. So the trick there is to say, actually, no, there's a load of Essex red-lipped endangered species there, it's supporting 111 different types of invertebrates, and it's actually protected, so we can't get rid of it. If you don't like the litter on the beach, maybe you should pick up your litter. So rather than looking at it as a messy thing, it's about trying to shift that culture of make everything tidy and clean and actually educate what are the benefits. What are you actually going to get out of it as a member of the public? And actually it does something for sea defence as well, which is good.
Yeah. Michal, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, maybe I could offer an approach that I already partly presented, a landscape approach, yeah? A landscape in which all the interests would be satisfied, meaning economic services, social, including not only what we've discussed so far, but also transport issues, etc., but also environmental issues, be it water retention, be it soil regeneration, be it forest resilience, biodiversity, etc., and also social issues. Yeah, and these approaches do exist, and also the European Commission now is more and more looking into this kind of approach, yeah? Trying to ensure, not to impose on anybody, but to propose ways how these interests could find a balance within in communities, regions, and countries.
Yeah. I think this kind of brings together the some of the barriers that were already mentioned earlier about getting that community engagement, which will drive politicians to support and listen to those changes. And it's also about that ownership that was also mentioned. So be that land ownership or just being really involved with the project directly, not just being informed about what's being done by the overlords. I think your point, Jean-Marie, is perhaps something that we need to ask all the coastal practitioners and managers and engineers. Why are they only, talking about the aspects of economic value or the aspects of perhaps easily measurable things that are not linked to necessarily the standard of living, the social aspects, the perhaps hard to quantify aspects such as does it look nice? Perhaps that's something that is very difficult to quantify but needs to be talked about. So I think it's a really good point. Any more questions? We've got Justin over there.
Well, just to pick up really on that point, keep it going, and really John's point around the walking away or just sort of abandonment is a nature-based solution in its own right. And in policy terminology, in our shoreline management plans that sort of set policy for coastal management within England and Wales, that's called no active intervention. So there's a name for that, and there is and for a long time has been a concerted effort to use an understanding of the coastal processes to drive policy. And in that way, really, you put your sort of no active intervention as your sort of default policy option. You've really got to demonstrate why, by exception, you would do anything other than rely on the natural coastal processes to provide a sustainable buffer against sea level rise and climate change. And in that way, you're putting the evidence front and centre in terms of the baseline for decision making, because only from understanding what the evidence tells us in a robust way do we make sensible decisions. And it's something that everyone can coalesce around, communities and the practitioners and local politicians, is because you'll get that small percentage who will deny the evidence, but for the greater part now, people will all coalesce and accept that the evidence is the evidence. No one person can change that. So you have to come up then with an adaptive response to what that evidence is showing. In policy terms, no active intervention is the most powerful policy we've got, and it's, as we're saying, that's getting away from just doing discrete pieces of coastal management which sort of don't take account of the knock-on impacts elsewhere. Mm-hmm. So we've got to be doing this. It's about having that joined-up thinking, and I think as coastal practitioners we do value the environment and the environmental benefits and the socio-economic benefits associated with recreation, health and well-being that can be delivered or can be derived through delivering a high-quality environment. And it's always difficult because we're trying to sort of attach everything, give everything a monetary value. But I think we need to find ways of moving away from that where we can, to find these what's traditionally been non-tangible in economic terms, and finding a way of actually sort of implementing policy through those values.
Yeah, I think there is also an aspect in England where it might be a bit different to some of the countries on the continent and around the world, where in England the Environment Agency is in charge of maintaining and managing a lot of the coastal defences. So they can, obviously, correct me if I'm wrong, but you can have quite a lot of power over the kind of long-term strategies on those defences. There are some notable exceptions, as John might want to point out, that Southend Council is actually managing their own defences. but
But we
perhaps...
still have to go through the EA for approval.
Yeah, well, there you go. But when we look at some of the other countries where perhaps it is a far bigger issue with a broad range of stakeholders who own little bits of land next to each other, and each one has their own kind of agendas. Some of the questions that we had actually came in, which kind of touch upon this, and it comes back to the land ownership, is how do we optimize the use of that limited land availability for investment, including nature-based solutions, where, especially for private owners, there might be a lot of other far more attractive solutions where to kind of tick the box, they might do some carbon offsetting, or they might generate a little bit of land somewhere to one side and say, oh great, ecosystem services and biodiversity net gain, whilst all they're actually doing is building a hotel, because that's going to give them the value. And this might be especially challenging in places where there is a lot of small landowners. So perhaps that's something that Heather can answer in terms of
I
the...
saw that question earlier, and I've already agreed to divert it to the other co-founder of Biodiversity Capital, who can answer it in a much more articulate way. So maybe you could hand the mic to him.
Thank you. So yeah, I saw that question on the screen. It's about competing land uses and going for the quick buck, more or less. And the question was also saying that yeah, you can get paid to plant woodland, the various woodland creation credits. There might be an incentive to plant the fastest growing conifers you can get your hand on and create a monoculture, which is no good for biodiversity. So, and coming on to the question about the fragmentation and how things can be pooled and optimized, what we're seeing is, certainly in England, we're seeing farming clusters emerging. And there's an organization that historically has been helping farmers with their grant applications that's been encouraging farmers to come together into localized clusters and then come up with a master plan for sort of creating ecosystem services on their what was farmland, which might still be partly used for crops, but might also be used for habitat creation, woodland creation. And the best form of optimization, both for the natural environment and economically now, is creating the stackable benefits. So is a series of benefits which are working together. So you can have flood defense, you can have carbon sequestration in the woodland, but also in grassland and peatland, biodiversity net gain. And then if it's optimized, then the farmer is getting paid separately for each of those things, each of those benefits that they're creating, even though they might have created those benefits through, they might only need to do a limited amount of things to get a larger range of benefits.
Yeah. Does anyone have any comments or additions to that? No? I think you covered it perfectly there. Okay, so I'll move on to the next question, which is for Michal. So coming... Yeah, do you want to just add to...
May I just react quickly, because I liked your intervention a lot on the do nothing alternative. Yes, indeed, and at least the impact assessments that I've been part of, they always did include the zero alternative, do nothing. My question only is, when I was thinking about it, whether this doing nothing, I believe we could afford only to repair or fix the harm we did as humans to the coast. But what about the additional impact of climate change? Is it still possible to do nothing in longue durée? What I'm talking about is again one of the debates in Egypt at COP27 about the tipping points. Melting of Greenland is 7 meters up. Yeah, and the tipping point is this fraction, several points of grades of centigrade away. Yeah, it's not linear. Now we are talking about centimeters of sea level rise, but very quickly, and under business as usual, we will talk really in terms of years about decimeters and potentially meters. So can we still afford doing nothing? Or even another question, within a project like this one, shouldn't we, not necessarily going public with that, but shouldn't we start a little bit thinking, what if we are talking meters? Do we know what we are going to do? No, sorry, just putting more questions.
It's always good to answer a question with a question. I think Justin wants to react to that.
Well, no, that last point is a good one because that relates to one of the other questions I put in there, which is about, with future-proofing against that, that several meters of rise, and obviously the lack of progress on mitigation points towards, well, we need to think about future-proofing, but we don't, within our constrained urban environments, we physically don't have the space to do that. I mean, I look at Cornwall, I look at Newlyn and Penzance where we're working, and I think we can work with maybe a metre of sea level rise and be honest with the community about their seafront is going to change and be adapted and modified, but the settlement broadly can continue to function as it sort of has done. But once we're above that sort of metre, I really start to think it becomes existential. And if we start to look at, think about 2 meters is huge. If we start to think about 7 meters, then, well, that's, that is just in another league completely. But on the subject of the do nothing, I don't think the do nothing or the no active intervention isn't just walking away, not thinking about it. We're still actually doing a lot. We're still monitoring the coastline, understanding its behaviour is the key to successful no active intervention. And what we see is where we remove defences that have been in place for a long time is that we go through a rapid process of catch-up where the coast will dynamically revert to a state of equilibrium. So we might see very rapid change occurring over 2 or 3 decades, and then actually that rate of change slows down again because the coast has been held artificially forward of where it might want to be. It goes through that rapid change, and then actually we've gained a lot of sediment from the cliffs eroding very rapidly, and then a state of equilibrium starts to reassert itself. So I think no active intervention is not just walking away and sort of deciding we just can't afford to do anything, but actually that's the most effective form of management. So I think it still requires monitoring and surveillance and understanding what's happening. That's the really important part.
Thanks, Justin. I think this also comes back to the issue. Well, we were talking about climate change and how it impacts the coastal management. I just wanted to bring up the financial aspect of nature-based solutions funding, and how is climate change actually included in that? So kind of building on your do nothing doesn't necessarily mean we're not thinking about the future and what will change, but are the current processes both at COP but also in the funding streams that Heather talked about, are they actually kind of future-proofing what we need to do above and beyond what's good enough today? Are they looking at the IPCC scenarios? Is climate included in the kind of funding side of things, and how is it included? Yeah, Michal?
Make 2 very quick points and then I hand over. First on IPCC and COP, I mean, I'm shaking with frustration. I haven't never ever seen 2 processes such divorced as IPCC on one hand and the COP on the other. IPCC report says everything you want to do, guys, do by 2030. because then it's very likely going to be late. Yeah? And there at the COP, people are talking years and decades, and everybody's being calm, and you don't really feel the sense of urgency there, and it's so super frustrating. It's COP27, and the emissions are still rising. Yeah, I mean, it's so divorced. That is one point. And on the funding, an example, positive. Yeah, we need to be positive also. You perhaps have noticed, at least the countries that are part of the European Union, the reform of the common agriculture policy. There is a huge, huge, huge change. Yeah? Now, one period is ending the end of this year. The new one is starting at the beginning of next year. And the change is depending, again, on the strategic plan of each country. But in each country now, it will make economic sense to do solutions, both in agriculture and in forestry, that are positive for climate change mitigation and adaptation. In other words, if you are a farmer now and you want to turn away from industrial agriculture and industrial forestry, and you want to put in place a landscape feature, a bulk or a water hole, whatever, you are going to revitalize a water stream, you are going to restate floodplains, you are going to be economically punished within the common agriculture policy rules. While as of the beginning of the new year, farmers will be rewarded. The extent, again, will depend on the strategic plan of each of the member states. And the same goes for forestry with, let's say, industrial forestry on one hand and climate smart forestry on the other. So at least here, finally, after 50 years of effort, we managed to change it a little bit, the common agricultural policy, to be more climate friendly.
Yeah, I think it's really encouraging to know that that's happening in the EU on the landscape. I think that I was going to say is that there needs to be systemic change and a kind of regeneration of economic thinking across the board. On the other hand, if there could be an investment model where just let nature take its course, that would be fantastic, because that's a really nice, actually beautiful model when you think about it. We have to get away from some of the things Michal was talking about in terms of this appetite for having to build things. It's like, no, we need to anti-build things. Being an architect, we need to stop building things and start appreciating nature. But anyway, I'm starting to become esoteric. In terms of answering your question, we're so sector driven. We so sort of have our head down trying to use the systems that we have in place. So in terms of the financial services ecosystem, the kinds of conversations that they have, that there is a kind of creep towards the project delivery, but it's really quite far apart. So you've got a few players who are partners. So the pension fund I mentioned in my presentation, Hermes, along with Finance Earth, which is a social enterprise, are working within the financial services ecosystem to try to come up with models that will fund climate mitigation, adaptation, biodiversity, and net zero solutions within a lot of constraints within England, because that's where the funding's coming. So it's not an international model. So you have savvy people who are coming up with a model. So that's good. That's a good news. Hopefully that can be upskilled and scaled by 2030. I don't know. That's less than a decade away. So it doesn't seem to be fast enough. So all I can say is it's disturbing. It's both positive to see that there are players who are working with that, who are savvy enough to be able to make those kind of steps, and we should be looking at those case studies. We should look at what they're doing and how it works and how it doesn't work, and share that, have a knowledge exchange on that. But at the same time, there's got to be some systemic change, I think, across the board to be able to meet the problem at scale.
Brilliant, thank you. Anyone has any comments, questions in the room? No? Okay, I'll kind of bring it back to SARCC a little bit because we're almost out of time. There was a few questions about the visualization toolkit and about the engagement side of things. So someone asked, how can we use the data in the visualization toolkit, focusing on coastal areas that are outside of the ones covered? And another question linking to the engagement is, what kind of tools did the SARCC partner use to engage with, for example, the 120,000 people in Cornwall during the roadshow? Is that something you could touch upon a little bit more, Garry?
Yes, well, to take the second one first, I think it was just a case of how you can try and manage the impact of the Discovery bus on whoever it might be, and the different levels of impact. There are some that are really just a general familiarity, like people quickly clicking onto your website but not staying, and then other ones that were people engaged more so and actually got involved, got on the bus, or then clicked on the QR codes and the like. Now, the larger numbers are really that people would have been exposed to it. So visitors might have seen it, might have been exposed, might just become aware of it, not necessarily going on in working with it. And the figures were gleaned from either when we tried to record people going nearby by the bus, or when we were in fixed venues where we knew the number of people that were there, so fairly broad. So there were different levels of engagement, effectively, and those bigger sums were the sort of broader level rather than specifics. And the initial, the first query was that looking about the visualization tool, yes, and how these sites can relate to other areas. And the thing is, these were just pilots, so we see them as just the beginning. And that comes back to comments that we made earlier about how can you cover all the coastline. And I think there will be different coastal units that we can look at, different geomorphological processes associated with different types of coastline. We're more of a northern Sylvesterine coastline up in this region. There'll be more rocky shores elsewhere. So the pilots that we worked on really just look at those particular sites with those, so say, geomorphological characteristics or morphological characteristics. But there are many more yet to be examined. But some of the tools and identifying, say, that applying the sort of cultural value, which again we sort of brushed on, that hasn't really been quantified financially, but applying that cultural value to those different regions, that they can be applied across the board. So the methods and the mechanisms used within the SARCC project can be applied anywhere. It's just that we need those little site types to work on next. So hopefully that's going to be the next phase.
Fantastic, thank you. So we're literally coming to an end now. So I'll have two final questions, and then we'll wrap up the day. So one of the things that has come up again and again throughout the entire project is the need for cooperation and for working with multiple different partners across multiple different countries. It's not enough to just focus on one small stretch of the coastline. I'm sure our Belgian partners will agree that they can do all they want, but if the Dutch decide to just dredge all the sediment that's coming down towards Belgium, they just won't have any sediment to use. So there is really that essential aspect of collaboration along the entire coastline. Perhaps a slightly silly question kind of linked to that, going to John, but was it really difficult to manage an international project with multiple time zones and multiple languages?
Easier than you think, actually. It's it just comes down to standard people management. Once you understand what people's skills are and get people working on a clear task or a clear deadline, it's not so bad. But there's been some challenges.
I think everyone's going to be aware of those. Okay, brilliant. Just to wrap up the panel discussion, I would like to ask each one of our panelists just to give us a little bit of a thought for the future, I suppose, or a bit of advice. What would you say, in your eyes, is the most important thing to focus on going forward in the next, say, 5 years? Do you want to just take that, John, and then we'll go towards me?
I guess like Michal says, we've got to stem the flow of carbon. Because if we don't do something now, it's a scary upward trend of everything changing. So yeah, I think we really need some action, some investment, and some big scale stuff done, because pilot projects like we've done are great, but it's a drop in the ocean. There's no smoke without fire.
Yeah. Garry?
Well, I think it's a case of awareness, and we need to make people know, stakeholders, decision makers, make them understand what these long-term issues are, long-term processes are. And I think once they find out, they look back to the past and see what's really happened, it can be quite shocking as an indicator of what might happen in the future. And I suppose that applies to what's happened, climate change in the past, which you can use the historical data sets to understand, as well as how that change is going to manifest itself in the future.
Heather?
Like I'll build on the panel's comments. Is what John was saying is big scale intervention is needed, and so we're a current culture of having a very short-term memories and being very tribal and having very short attention spans, and so we need to evolve and have a paradigm shift so that's behavior change across the board, because the scale of the problem is quite massive. But it can be unpacked, and that scale can be something that can be achieved, but through cross-border working from the community, and also from the agencies and from government intervention as well. But it's going to take everybody in that way. And I would say that we need to be looking to the mapping and Garry's map, because that could be very much the future. So this is how we might be living, and what the landscape might look like. And I think it's incredibly insightful to me anyway, to see what the landscape looked like, and it's how we're only a dot in time.
Mm-hmm. Michal?
And that's very humbling.
Yeah, first, if I may express my admiration for the project. I'm honestly so impressed by the 7 pilot projects, by the toolkit, by everything that has been presented. Wow, I mean, this is so encouraging to hear people that are doing things instead of talking about them. Just if you allow 2 quick points. Yeah? One is spatial planning. We have not discussed it much. Yeah? Spatial planning, I think, would be extremely important, especially on the coast where still it's not so busy, making sure that whatever kind of green space, whatever kind of space that would help us protect the coast would be planned at the same time and on equal footing with any kind of grey infrastructure. Not thinking hotel first and afterwards maybe if there is a bit of space to plant a tree, but really to plan it and from the very beginning. And my final point is flexibility. It's not global warming, it's climate change. We really do not know what will happen. I mentioned Greenland, but Greenland could bring a new ice age. Yeah? So what I would suggest, and I do not have a reply, I don't know how to do it, but in whatever we are doing, to implement the element of flexibility in the planning processes, in the participative processes, in the engineering processes, to ensure that whatever comes up, we know how to address it. Who are the people to react? Whom we ask? Whom we invite to for the council? Who should decide? Who should take also quick decision? So flexibility needs to be part of these systems.
Brilliant, thank you.